My name is Walt Powell. I'm executive security strategist with CDW. I've been a CISO and a virtual CISO, and now I am an advisor who helps CISOs build programs and strategies. I've been doing this for 15 some odd years, and I have dozens of certifications. I'm a graduate of the Carnegie Mellon CISO program, the Stanford Advanced Cybersecurity program. I'm a CISSP, a CISM, CCISO. So I have a pretty extensive security background. Today, we're going to talk about ransomware, as ransomware has been kind of the pandemic inside of the pandemic. You can't hardly go a day without hearing about a ransomware incident. So we're going to explore those. We're going to take a look at some of the history and background of ransomware, the modern multi-extortion landscape. We're going to take a look at some of the threat actors, some of their common TTPs, tactics and whatnot. We'll discuss some of the things that we can do about it. We'll take a look at brokers and cyber insurance and some of those other things as we explore this topic also. So things are not new necessarily with ransomware. Ransomware has been around for a long time. I can remember back to the late 90s, early 2000s when I personally got one of those fake antivirus on my personal machine, right? Where the fake antivirus pops up and says, hey, you need to pay us in order to make this message go away. So this has been around since kind of the dawn of the internet. But things changed about 2017. So the economy of ransomware had worked because you could get your stuff back and people were willing to pay because the cost was pretty low and you had a pretty good chance of recovering your equipment, data, etc. Well, that all changed in 2017 when the Russians used these same ransomware tactics to attack the Ukrainians. And they used this variant that became known as NotPetya to attack the Ukrainians. And the idea was never to be able to decrypt. You weren't supposed to be able to decrypt it. They wanted to ruin their data, but it was also supposed to stay inside the Ukraine, and they didn't realize how much it would leak. And once Petya got out and started to impact corporations globally, and there started to be variants, it ruined the ransomware economy because people were like, hey, you can't count on getting your stuff back anymore. You can make the payment and it doesn't necessarily do you any good. And so people stopped paying for a while, and you started to see a decline in ransomware and an increase in things like hijacking compute to try and do covert crypto mining and things like that. The bad guys realized that they needed to diversify their portfolios to increase the amount of money that they were making, and that cryptography wasn't the only thing you could extort people with. So they started doing additional streams of extortion, and that's how we ended up where we are today. So the current landscape today, multi-extortion is nearly 81% of the ransomware today. It just keeps growing. So the primary attack is still that data encryption channel. But prior to that, we're going to steal as much data as possible. And then they're going to disclose that information if you don't pay them. And they stand up these, what they're called name and shame websites, where they take the information that they gathered and they share it out to the world. The maze has been especially good at this because the maze has managed to keep a clear text main internet website for name and shame, where most of these guys have their name and shame sites in the dark web where average people can't go see it. So really, they're trading in this information with other criminals more than with the general public, where you really would get shamed. But the maze, while they are retired now, still have their public facing website up where you can go see this information. Starting in like the late 2019, early 2020, this really became a popular tactic, and there were about 5 groups that were doing this very heavily. Doppelpaymer, Ryuk, the Maze were doing this double extortion technique, and it really was a perfect storm that coincided with the pandemic. And they were able to leverage the changes that happened during the pandemic to really ramp up their ability to deliver this ransomware and to make the most impact and make the most money from this ransomware. Because right as this was becoming a tactic in late 2019, early 2020, the pandemic started happening, and there were just massive changes in people's behavior, right? We started to work from home, and we started to changed the way we interacted with our work data, and we were getting emails to try and tell us what to do. And there was just this massive amount of uncertainty, right? We were going home, we were locking down, we were having new work processes. We didn't know how long we were going to be away from the office or what these new lockdown procedures were going to look like. People were confused, they were anxious, and the bad guys took advantage of this. They sent out phishing attacks with COVID lures and work from home lures. Also, it really just increased the attack surface because we weren't prepared for remote work. We didn't have our act together as far as securing endpoints outside of our perimeters. We didn't have our game together as far as securing remote access. And those new attack vectors were easy targets for the bad guys. On top of that, as everyone started to be out of work, it increased the labor pool for criminals. And I read an article about the economy of temporary workers in ransomware in Italy, because Italy was one of the first countries to lock down. And as people didn't have jobs, they needed to figure out how to maintain their income. And the cyber actors were more than ready to snatch up all this free or all this low cost labor who was now suddenly available. All this has driven just a huge increase in the impacts, in the costs. The average ransomware cost in Q1 of 2020, so a year ago, was just over $100,000. And in Q1 of this year, it's over $200,000. And it just keeps growing, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30% per quarter. That's enormous growth. That's spectacular growth. The ransomware economy is almost $1.5 billion just in the United States. And that's just the ransom portion. That doesn't include the impacts of ransomware. If you take a look at the impacts to businesses, the average downtime is over 2 weeks. And so if you factor in the losses in addition to the responses, the remediations, the ransoms themselves, it's almost a $10 billion economy just in the United States for ransomware. That's a huge impact. And part of that is driven by some of the main players, right? So while the average ransom payment is $200,000, there are groups like Ryuk who have targeted and created like whaling, big game hunting, where they target large corporations to try and get big ransoms. And their average ransom payment is way over $1 million. And we'll take a look at some in a little bit here, where it's not uncommon to see big companies paying $10 million and more in a single ransom payment. The increase has just spiked 400 times, right? Or 400% since early 2019 when this all kind of started, right? So the impacts are financially are enormous, but more than that, when we talk about what happens with attacks and we think about the types of attacks, whether they're data breaches or insider threat or other pieces of malware or whatever it is, oftentimes when we talk in security about what the impact of a thing is, we talk about the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. There's a move lately where I've seen people are trying to add a fourth leg, which is safety, like security, safety. But usually there's one or maybe two of these legs in any type of thing that we're talking about. One of the big problems with ransomware is that it's all three. It's the confidentiality portion with this modern malware where they're exfiltrating our data. We're losing this data, encrypting it, possibly wiping it. There's business disruption from the loss of our systems, from the loss of our data. So it's all three. And it's a rare occasion that you see attacks that are all three. Beyond that, it hits kind of every tenet of risk. So if you look at corporate risk, enterprise risk, yes, it's obviously a financial risk from ransoms and response costs, but there's operational risks due to your productivity loss. You can run up against fines from lack of compliance. It's not uncommon to see class action lawsuits behind breaches. So you're looking at legal costs, potentially judgments, reputational damage. Now, I'm not a huge believer in long-term reputational damage, but that's a talk for another day. But at least short-term reputational damage. It's very common to see short-term stock value hits, some customer churn, and then loss of competitive advantage, a strategic loss. If you take a look at Apple just got hit by a ransomware, and their threat actors disclosed the schematics of yet to be released iPhones. Like, that's a huge competitive advantage loss. So it hits all of the things, right? It hits all of the parts of the CIA triad. It hits all of the risks. It doesn't get much worse than multi-extortion ransomware. And when we talk about how it's impacted the market and who it's impacted and who the victim list looks like, where this all started for me was late in 2019. I like to wake up in the morning and I will read like cyber news. I especially love Cyware's DCR, Daily Cyber Roundup, I think is what it stands for. And I'll read through the cyber news and see what's going on in the world of cyber stuff. And I kept seeing these names over and over and over: the Maze, Doppelpaymer, the Maze. And so I started talking to my peers. I was talking to other CISOs. I was talking to other people in security firms and saying, like, hey, what do we know about this? What are we seeing about this? I'm seeing this name every single day. And I just was met with kind of a lot of apathy in kind of late 2019. They're like, yeah, it's ransomware. This is not a new idea. Who cares? But I noticed it so much that I started keeping a spreadsheet of all the mentions. And when I first made this presentation back in March of 2020, I could fit all of the attacks on this one slide. And I was just keeping this spreadsheet and I was fitting all the attacks on this one slide. Well, that's not the case anymore. This is a very old slide. There are now more than 2,600 victims that we know for sure have just been named on the name and shame sites. 740 of those victims were new just this last quarter. It's an enormous increase. So it's impossible now for me to even begin to try and think about keeping a running list of all of the attacks. There is a website that keeps a pretty good list, this Cloudian website that I took a screenshot of. But it's impossible to stay on top of all of the attacks because it happens daily, literally daily, sometimes multiple times a day. And there have been some really notable ones, right? The Colonial Pipeline got a lot of press. They were shut down for 5 days. They paid a $5 million ransom. It impacted the price of gas along the Eastern Seaboard for a few days. Like, that's a pretty major impact. But honestly, it's not even one of the worst attacks, right? Acer, the chip manufacturer, during a time when we're already having unprecedented chip shortages, got ransomed and paid the largest ransom in the history of ransoms at $50 million. We've seen some crazy outages. The Buffalo public school system was closed for a week and ended up losing the personal data of 36,000 students. Lucky Star Casinos, that's one you probably never even heard of. They had 6 casino locations shuttered for 2 weeks. I can't even imagine what the financial impact of closing 6 casinos for 2 weeks is. It's insanity. Garmin, you probably heard about Garmin. They paid a $10 million ransom. Honda was one of the first who actually had their production line shut down because of operational technology ransomware, right? They were able to shut down their OT, and they had their factory shut down for multiple days internationally. The Kaseya one that just happened is especially scary because it's a marriage of like supply chain attacks like we saw with like SolarWinds Sunburst and ransomware. And I'm predicting way more of that kind of thing, right? And then Accenture is notable for a couple of reasons. Even though they didn't end up paying the ransom, their ransom demand was $50 million for starters, which is crazy, but they're one of the companies that we count on to protect us from this kind of stuff. And even they can't seem to protect themselves from it. But part of the reason they couldn't is because a few very interesting things happened here. They appear to be one of the first folks where the bad guys paid disgruntled insiders for access. So they just paid their employees to give them access. But they did end up losing a ton of client information, like 2,600 some odd files, according to some reports. And I haven't gotten 100% firm confirmation that they can actually tie these 100% back, but there are a lot of reports that their clients had follow-on attacks based on the information that was disclosed, and that's major, right? So I was hoping that I could see you guys, or that maybe I could put up a poll, but you'll just have to be honest. Maybe you can see each other in your videos. But how many of you feel like your organization is too small or your information's not valuable enough to be a target of these ransomware groups? We just talked about Honda and Garmin and all these kind of big name places. And it's very common for people to feel like this doesn't pertain to me because I'm too small. My organization's information isn't valuable. Nobody cares. So just show of hands, or don't show of hands in your mind. If you feel like that's the case, it's probably not. And you can see here, oh, cool. Someone threw up my moderator threw up a poll for me. I should have planned that in advance. We'll see what the poll says. So I'm going to skew the poll by telling you the answer now. And the answer is you're not too small and your data is not too unimportant. So as you look at this, no industry has been spared. While state and local government has been hit especially hard. Healthcare has taken a lot of the brunt of this. No industry has been spared. There's no industry that's not a target. And when you look at sizes, nearly 70% of all of the attacks happen to organizations that have less than 1,000 employees. And almost all of the attacks happen to organizations that have less than 10,000 employees, right? So everyone is a target. Everyone is on the list. This is happening so frequently every day. It's opportunity for these guys. And we'll talk a little bit about how they've split up the groups, and the groups have different roles now, and access is its own role where people are just trying to monetize just the access. So we'll take a look at that in a minute too. Same as the victims, I used to try and track who were the threat groups that were doing this, right? It was easy in the early days. There were 5 or 6 of them, and you could kind of track who was doing what, and as they evolved, you could watch their tactics. But a few things have happened. So the extortion groups, as they start to get cracked down by the United States government and get put on sanction lists and stuff, they'll rebrand. They're kind of loose affiliation groups, and so they'll spin off, and there's copycat groups, and the fields become very, very crowded, and there's tons and tons of these groups now. One of the things that's happened too is that these groups used to be like a group did all the things, but that's not really the case anymore. As we started to see ransomware as a service, we started to see that the roles would split up. So in the early days, ransomware as a service, some group who developed the piece of ransomware software would sell it or rent it out to other people to distribute. Well, we're seeing that it's becoming even more fragmented than that. So it's very common for someone to do just the initial access and monetize that. And so there's people out looking for the way to get into your system, and then they'll sell that to another group. And then that group will go rent the ransomware from the creator, and they'll go deploy that ransomware, and then they'll get a kickback from the creator who actually collects the ransom. And so there's different people along the way who are monetizing different parts of the process, and they all take a different chunk of the ransom payment, right? Because of this, it's very easy for guys to be like, oh, I've done this part long enough, I'm going to start my own shop. Or I don't like working with this guy, I'm going to go work with another guy. And so they're kind of loose groups. So oftentimes when you hear the term ransom gang, you think like a gang of set members. Well, that's not so much the case anymore. And this is a little more nebulous, and folks will work together, right? The other thing that happens is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the U.S. Office of Foreign Asset Control, will get a hold of a name, and they will put them on a sanction list and make it illegal for you to pay a ransom to them. And when this happens, the bad guys just change their name, and they'll rebrand. So like the media loves to talk about Evil Corp. They're the first one on the list. I think it's because their name is really salacious and it sounds scary, but they've also been a constant presence in ransomware. They've done a lot of kind of the nasty ransomwares, Wasted Locker and BitPaymer. Their current thing is called Payload Bin. Indrik Spider, the Doppelpaymer folks, they were one of the ones I said started it all for me. They were one of the names I noticed first. They didn't quit. They just quit using the name Doppelpaymer. They changed their name to Grief Corp, I think, as a nod to Evil Corp, when they got put on the sanction list. And so it's basically the same group. They just changed their name, right? Ryuk, we already mentioned, are kind of the inventors of big game hunting. They were one of the top earners in 2020, but they've spun off now and are really doing Conti version 2, which is the #1 variant currently. Same group, though. They've been super prolific. Same thing happened with DarkSide. DarkSide was the name you heard with Colonial Pipeline, and Colonial Pipeline got so much press that they shut down behind that, but then have immediately rebranded and are calling themselves Black Matter. Same group. Revil is one you'll see their name a lot. They were who was behind the CISA supply chain attack. Just in the last 2 weeks, I started seeing the name Colossus, which appears to be a rebrand of Revil. So Revil, Sodanakibi seems to be rebranding as Colossus. It's hard to tell. Maybe it's a spinoff. Maybe it's a rebrand. Not sure, but that's a name we're seeing a lot more of. But groups have started to realize that the way to make money is to get in, hit it hard, and get out fast. So if you look at this little chart of who's the top players, the #2 one in the first half of 2021 was Avedon, and Avedon's already gone. They've already retired. They've announced their retirement, and they've moved on. However, people are speculating that there's this new variant called Heron, which they think is just Avedon. So they've realized that the move is get in, hit it as hard as you can, get as many samples out there as you can so that you can collect the maximum amount of money, target the big targets, and then get out before the heat is on you and reorganize, right? So how do they get in? What are their common ways in, right? We probably should have planned another poll here, but like, think to yourselves, like, what do you think is the top infection vector? What do you think is the way people get in and get their ransomware into your network and into people's environments? And most of the time when I ask this question, the answer I get is phishing. And while phishing is still one of the main ways that people get in general, and that breaches happen in general, and if you look at the Verizon DBIR, phishing always is #1. For ransomware specifically, remote access is actually #1 most of the time. It kind of fades back and forth with phishing, but especially behind the pandemic, what we saw was there was so much open remote access, just unsecured RDP, open to the internet RDP, remote access with no MFA, where people were reusing like known bad credentials from dumps, and they were just able to use remote access, and remote access became the #1 way that people were getting in and delivering ransomware, with phishing being #2. And phishing, they've really tailored their messages, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of phishing lures that were emulating like the CDC, giving you information about like lockdowns and stuff like that. We're starting to see that evolve too, and we're going to see a lot more of these phishing lures as we come back to work. Phishing lures about mask mandates, phishing lures about vaccination mandates, phishing lures about having to come back into the office and not work remote anymore. Anything that's a trigger that will get people excited to click on an email, they're going to use as a phishing lure. And so we're seeing a lot of pandemic related phishing lures, right? One of the common ways to weaponize your phishes are to either scrape a website and ask you to input your credentials, or to attach an attachment, weaponized Office or PDFs, right? You can make a macro inside of an Office document, launch a PowerShell script, and that's a thing that you see pretty frequently, because a lot of companies just can't turn off macros, right? Behind those two main ones, we also see some drive-by downloads, just like you went to a bad website and you got it as a drive-by download. We see it in like torrenting. You downloaded free software and you got ransomware. And then the latest one I talked about was pay for access, where ransomware groups are contacting disgruntled insiders and asking them to sell access. We're even seeing it now in the ransom notes. They'll put the solicitation in the ransom note, and so that it pops up on everybody's screen and it says, hey, you want to make some money? You want to sell us some access to whatever things you have access to? We'll pay you, right? The bad guys are starting to look a lot more like nation states and a lot more like advanced persistent threats and ATPs, and less like the kind of low end criminals we oftentimes think about when we think about financially motivated cybercrime, right? They're taking the tactics that the nation states use and they're repurposing them to do this kind of multi-extortion, right? So it used to be point in time, right? You'd get a piece of ransomware and it would launch immediately. It was noisy. It would start encrypting your stuff. You would see it right away. Well, that's not the case anymore. There's enormous amounts of dwell time with most of these actors now, where they will get in and they'll spend their time. So they get the initial access foothold, and that may be through gaining access through your remote access, through unsecured RTP, or they land a piece of malware through phishing, right? And they have that macro launch a PowerShell script or whatever it is. Oftentimes what they're landing are just repurposed old banking Trojans. So you'll see a lot of TrickBot and Emotet. Here lately, it's been QBot, which is also sometimes called QuackBot, or like I've even heard it called Pink Slip Bot. They'll land these kind of regular old Trojans that have been around for a long time, and then use them to execute other parts of their attack kill chain, right? One of the big things that you'll see a lot is Cobalt Strike. And Cobalt Strike was originally a white hat tool. It's a pen testing tool, but Cobalt Strike can do a bunch of very powerful things. It can execute PowerShell scripts. It can do key logging. It can take screenshots. It can download files. It can help you pivot around MFA. It can spawn other payloads. Cobalt Strike has a module called Beacon. Beacon can set up command and control traffic back to my server to exfiltrate data, and it can make it look like normal traffic over like HTTPS or port 56 DNS traffic even. You can also use it to set up peer-to-peer command and control over server message blocks, so that you can do east-west and you can move east-west. So what they'll do is they'll go find all the data and they'll move it east-west inside of your network and get it all in one centralized place, and then shoot it up to their command and control server to steal it. Once they've moved all around your network, found all the things there are to find, stolen all the data they want to steal, get it all exfiltrated out to their command and control servers, that is when they'll come in and oftentimes manually launch the cryptography portion, right? Because the cryptography portion is noisy, and that's when you're for sure going to notice them. A lot of the times this other stuff goes unnoticed because people just aren't good at doing the discovery. And so you notice it when they start encrypting stuff. So they'll do that very last. They'll start the encryption. And used to be the note would pop up immediately, but a lot of the time they'll try and get the encryption and stuff to run as long as possible before the note pops up, because sometimes people don't even notice that this has happened until the note pops up on their screen. Like they didn't even notice the encryption. They didn't notice any of the parts of this until they got the note. So they try and do as much as they can quietly, and that ability to be quiet, move around, set up command and control, move east-west, exfiltrate data, those used to be strictly like ATP moves, and now every kind of financially motivated ransom group are using these same tactics. So what do we do about it? What can we possibly do about it? Well, the good news is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The fine folks at NIST already laid out the wheel for you, right? We've known for years what to do. We just haven't been good at things like access management and data security. And so the bad guys pick on the things we're weak at, right? There are ransomware specific things that we can do in each one of these 5 areas. And so we'll take a look at some of those things, right? So under identify, one of the main things we can do is just asset inventory. This is a place where people still are very, very weak, even though it is control number 1 in the CIS critical 20 controls. It's a place where organizations still lack, right? And it's impossible to secure things that you don't know that you have and you don't know where they are. Beyond that, we're going to talk in protection about like endpoint security and endpoint agents and things like that. And you can't deploy endpoint security to endpoints you don't know what they are, where they are, etc. In addition to that, the key to most of the survival of ransomware attacks is disaster recovery business continuity, right? So how is our disaster recovery business continuity planning? And at the heart of that, where do you start is with business impact analysis, right? What is our risk appetite for starters? So you can do a risk assessment, but even prior to a risk assessment, just do you understand your risk appetite? Do you know what risks you're willing to accept? Do you know what your expectation is for recovery time objectives, for recovery point objectives? Have you understood what your critical assets are, what your sensitive assets are? So critical assets are things you can't live without. Sensitive assets are the things that would be bad if they got out, right? Do we know what they are? Do we know where they are? Do we know how long we can live without our critical assets? What is a threat? What's an existential threat? What's our expectation, right? Even just starting with business impact analysis is where you start in the planning phase, right? And then a lot of the other controls and places where we're weak, to get to access control and to get to data protection, we've got to do some governance, right? We got to have our identity house in order. And to get our identity house in order, how do we do governance of identities? Do we understand our roles? Do we understand what it means to be released privilege and who should have privileges, et cetera? Do we know what our data is? Do we know where our data is? Do we have a way to classify it, a classification system, even if that's just public and private? And once we choose what's public and private, do we have a way to tag it? Under protect, one of the biggest things we can do to protect and to prepare for recovery is backup, 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 right? We need to back up. We need to be backing up with some kind of a scheme. A 3-2-1 scheme is great. Maintain 3 copies of your data, 1 primary, 2 backups. In 2 different places or on 2 different kinds of media, and one of those places should be offsite, and cloud is perfect for that, right? We need to make sure that we're not leaning on Microsoft shadow copies for one of our backups, because all of the bad guys are going to attack shadow copies right away. Turn off shadow copies, delete the copies. Almost every modern malware attacks them immediately and destroys those copies. In addition to that, making sure we're doing endpoint security. And this is a place where people struggle because Gartner has made it difficult, right? Gartner has APP, Endpoint Protection Platform, EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response, Next-Gen AVs, and people think I need to have one of each, and that's not necessarily the case. What we need to have is a protection layer and a detection layer. We need to have something that is swatting down known bad samples and something that allows us to go out and investigate and quarantine when the bad thing happens. Because even if we have the greatest protection in the world and we're getting, I don't know, 99.6% protection, that doesn't scale. If we're getting 100,000 malware samples a year, that's 400 that get through, right? That's 1 a day. And if we're getting 1 a day through, then we have to be able to investigate, right? So we need protection, we need detection. Those things need to happen together, right? Vulnerability management, and I know this sounds like table stakes, and people are like, yeah, of course, vulnerability management. But when you read Verizon DBIR, every single year, there continue to be in the top exploits, like 5-year-old vulnerabilities constantly. We're just not good at it. We still have SMB open. I talked about like one of the ways that they do east-west command and control is through server message blocks, and we just don't have SMB updated. We don't have it patched, and there's a lot of people who could just flat turn it off and haven't explored that. Same thing with macros, right? There's the idea that we can't possibly turn off macros, but we probably can. And then just basic Microsoft patching, and beyond Microsoft patching, even if we're good at Microsoft patching, we're oftentimes not good at third-party patching. We're not patching our Adobes and our Apaches and things like that, right? Under detection, we want to do detection along the SOC visibility triad, right? So something in logging, something on endpoint, something on network that are doing detection and response, right? We need to be hunting for known IOCs. We need to align our content, our rules, our SIM rules to the MITRE attack framework. So part of the reason that these bad guys are continuing to get away with this, and I talked about they're looking more and more like APTs, and people don't notice that this is happening until the crypto part, it's because we're not looking for the things that they're doing. We are not collecting the logs that let us see PowerShell executions. We are not we're not aligned to the MITRE framework looking for Cobalt strike executions and looking for exfiltration IOCs and things that we know that they do. Like the ideas here are not super novel. And if we were looking for those things, not only would we find this ransomware, we'd have found things like SolarWinds Sunburst. Like it's the same tactics and it's possible to see them. We should be integrating threat intel feeds into our SIMs where possible. And we just haven't done a lot of this like kind of next gen. Like a lot of people still don't have SIM, and those who do haven't really layered in the next gen things that allow us to do like AIML, user behavior analytics, stuff like that. In addition to the SOC visibility triad, there's a cool proposed standard called security.txt, and that's the idea that we can append to our website. So USAA has done this. If you go out to usaa.com/security.txt, and there may actually be another slash in there, I don't remember. I think there may be another like URI subdomain or whatever. But the idea is you can go out to this and everybody will have their domain /security.txt, which is a TXT file that tells you how to get in touch with their security team and report vulnerabilities. So if you were a researcher or even just a person who stumbled across a problem, or you were out on the dark web and you heard chatter, or you saw my stuff for sale or whatever it was, you could come report it to me and I could do some discovery that way. This is a cool idea, and it's a thing that you can go do basically for free today. Like add a security.txt file to your domain with information about how can you report to me when you see bad things happening to me. And the last one is Respond, and we're going to spend a bunch of time on Respond here, talking about cyber insurance and brokers and how to make payments, when to make payments, if you should make payments, etc. But the core of response is incident management, right? You need to have an incident management program that includes a formal incident response plan that has written calling trees and what to do, how to break glass in case of emergency, who to call. Is there a hotline for our cyber insurance? How do we get in touch with our forensic partners? When do we call third-party legal? When do we tell executives? How do we report? All should be in your incident response plan. And then that plan needs to be tested, right? So as we build out playbooks for different types of incidents that can happen, we need to test them, because dealing with incidents is going to bring in people from all kinds of teams who don't usually work together. You're going to bring in people from legal and people from IT and people from security and people from communications and marketing and executives. And it's a little bit like trying to field a baseball team of players who've never met each other before. So what do you do when you want to put together a baseball team? You practice. Same thing here. We need to practice. We need to test. We need to make sure that our plan works. Additionally, we need to make sure that our plan is aligned to our cyber insurance. If we're paying for cyber insurance, what gets us paid? What are the things that we need to do to make sure that we can file a claim? Do we need to contract with people that are on panel? If so, are our preferred forensic partner and third-party legal on panel? Can I get them added to panel? How do I make sure that I'm doing the things that I have to do to get paid? The incident management should help establish a CERT team. And I know for a lot of folks, people are like, hey, a CERT team is too much for my organization. We're a very small organization. CERT team doesn't have to be like what CERT is for the US government. It just means here are the people who are responsible. Here are the people who are going to do which jobs in case of emergency, right? And then ransomware specific playbooks, right? We may already have playbooks for what to do in the event of malware, etc., or maybe we have a process for quarantining or nuke and pave or whatever it is, but do we have one that's ransomware specific? So when a ransomware event happens, what should we do? Well, the very first thing we should do is get that device off our network, right? Quarantine it, turn it off, unplug it, whatever we have to do. Turn it off is generally one of your worst choices because sometimes things exist in memory that you will lose, and there's some evidence or whatever that can be had there. But it is better if you don't have any other choices to turn it off than it is to let them continue to do whatever it is they're doing. Once you've got your devices quarantined, then you need to just determine the scope of your attack, right? What's involved? Laptops, have they gotten to servers? Have they encrypted stuff on our SAN, on our network shares in the cloud? Where do we have encryption? Where do we know we have malware? Can we figure out what the scope of this is and get as many of these machines shut down as possible? Then we want to start to identify, like, what are we dealing with, right? Oftentimes we can figure out what the ransomware variant is. We need to read the note and make sure we understand all of the terms, make sure we understand all of the deadlines. That'll also often tell us who we're dealing with, what variant we're dealing with. The note gives a lot of clues, and we can use that information later to do some recovery things and try and find decryptors and stuff like that. And so that's the last part, is we can start determining what our recovery options are, right? There are a lot of options for things you can do before you pay the ransom, and you should try to do all of them prior to paying a ransom. So do you have backups? Can you restore from backups? Is there a commercially available decryption tool? A lot of the anti-malware vendors have decryption tools for some of the better known ransomware variants. Some of the brokers and breach coaches and stuff have access to some decryptors and stuff too. And sometimes you can run the decryptor tool and get your stuff decrypted. That doesn't necessarily keep you from still having the disclosure. So you have to have the discussion about accepting the loss. Can we accept the disclosure loss? Can we accept some data loss? What does that look like? If we get to the answer where the answer is absolutely no, we can't accept whatever the remaining loss is, we couldn't figure out how to decrypt it, we don't have backups to restore from, and it's time to talk about making a payment, well, then we have to discuss what the risks of payment are, right? Payment doesn't just fix everything. There are risks to payment. One of the big risks is non-recovery. You don't always recover, even from reputable, and I'm using that in quotes here, ransom folks, right? It's often you can get the wrong key, or you get the right key and their decryption utility is bad, or your files got corrupted, or you can't mount your database or whatever it is in the decryption tool. Sometimes there's double decryption, sometimes even from different groups. So we talked about how the groups are segmented. So one group might have encrypted it, then another group might have encrypted on top of it. You get that decrypted and the next guy is already encrypted and you got to pay twice. If you're a juicy target who pays, what keeps folks from repeat targeting you? That absolutely happens. Also, there's legal violations, which we'll talk about more here in a minute, but most of these groups are sanctioned and you shouldn't be paying them, and there's possibly legal ramifications to paying them. Your insurance premiums, even though your insurance is going to pay this, you're certainly going to increase your premiums. It's going to be super hard to get insurance. And insurance is one of, still, even with the climbing premiums and the difficulty of obtaining the underwriting, it's still one of the best ways to like write down risk. And you're bolstering the ransomware economy. The more you pay bad guys, the more bad guys want to do this, and they're not going to stop doing it until we stop paying them. So if you want to pay them, you probably shouldn't pay them yourself. You should get a ransomware broker, and there's a bunch of these now. And the ransomware broker will do a number of things for you. They will negotiate on your behalf. They'll try and negotiate down the ransom cost. They'll negotiate the terms. They can sometimes extend deadlines. Also, all these bad guys want paid in cryptocurrency. So instead of you having to figure out how to get $1 million worth of Bitcoin or whatever it is and put it in a wallet and make sure you get it exchanged appropriately, they will handle all of that for you. They will do all of the crypto transactions. They will handle the encryption key exchanges and make sure that you get good decryption tools and help make sure that you actually get your stuff back. These ransom brokers also obviously take a fat fee. Oftentimes that can be written down on what happens on the negotiation of your ransom cost. but we've also started to see that threat actors are threatening data deletion if you involve a broker. And that'll be sometimes part of the threat note, right? If you involve a broker, we're going to delete all your data. So if you're going to make a payment, there's the official guidance and the unofficial guidance. The official guidance, if you called me in an official capacity and said, what do? I would say, don't ever pay a ransom. You're almost always in violation of federal law, Anti-Money Laundering Act, Bank Secrecy Act, Office of Foreign Asset Control. You probably shouldn't be paying them. My unofficial guidance is you should take it on a case-by-case basis, right? Extortion payments should be decided on a case-by-case basis by trusted parties. Your executive leadership, your GC, your third-party legal counsel, which may include a breach coach, if you have a forensic firm, your broker, and only once you've understood all the risks, then you can take on paying the ransom, and you should have a broker negotiated on your behalf. If you choose to do this, you cannot write this in your formal incident response plan. So we said you need a formal incident response plan. You cannot write in your formal incident response plan that you plan to pay ransoms, that you've set up a cryptocurrency wallet, that you've retained the services of a broker. All of that stuff is discoverable and is going to be a problem if you end up in court behind the breach in a class action where you just plan to give away the farm, right? You can't write this stuff down. So you can do it, but you can't write it down, which is a problem because when we're dealing with incident response, we want to make sure we have a plan for everything, right? So what's the future of this? And I need to go kind of fast because I'm running out of time and I want to make sure I leave enough time for Q&A. This has been very hard because a lot of the stuff that I wrote back in early 2000 has already happened. And so I'm trying to stay on top of what's the future because the bad things just keep mounting. So when I first wrote this, I said, look for more diversification. This originally was called double extortion ransomware, and now we're calling it multi-extortion ransomware because we're seeing more and more blending of different extortion types, and I expect to see more and more of that. I wrote in April of 2020, look for the inclusion of DDoS and starting to see more DDoS extortion. That's not a new idea, but look for it to be blended. Over the last 6 months, we've totally seen that. Over the last month, there's a group calling themselves Fancy Lazarus, who that's their whole game, right? Is DDoS extortion in addition to cryptography and the other things, right? The inclusion of things like crypto mining, embarrassment extortion. As we take more and more data, as they take more and more data, they're going to find stuff that's embarrassing to politicians, that's embarrassing to CEOs, that's embarrassing to corporations. Hey, we wrote this memo that is going to get us canceled or whatever. And we're going to start seeing extortion based on embarrassment. A lot more IoT lockout. We've already started to see that with Honda and Colonial Pipeline. I expect to see more and more of that, where they're just shutting down businesses through lockout of IoT. Data wiping, we're starting to see that also. I talked about data wiping if you include a broker, but data wiping as just another extortion tenant, right? And I thought auctions would be more popular, but people don't seem to want to buy this data. But when the right data comes along, we'll start to see auctions, right? Like we did with credit card numbers and whatnot. And that's just another way for them to make money. There are a lot new attack vectors, and we're going to see more and more of that. The inclusion of supply chain. This was another one that this was more relevant a year ago because we didn't have all this supply chain stuff. The inclusion of ransomware and supply chain attacks is just going to grow. More vectors. So I talked about IoT and OT as a lockout, but IoT and OT as an intrusion point. People are going to start getting in through your thermostat. They're going to start getting in through these other devices that you think are innocuous. They're going to get in through mobile devices. Mobile devices are super easy. There was just a 0-day from Apple that was used this week. So what keeps me from exploiting mobile devices and then waiting until you join your corporate network and then pivoting to your corporate network? Cobalt Strike now has a cousin, Vermilion Strike, that works on Linux. Other things I'm predicting, cyber insurance underwriting requirements are going to continue to spiral out of control. Premiums are continue to get higher and higher and higher, and it's going to get harder and harder to get. And I think that's going to impact who pays ransoms, and it's going to hurt the ransomware economy because a lot of the corporations that are choosing to pay ransoms today aren't paying them out of their own pocket. Cyber insurers are paying them. And I think cyber insurers are going to start shutting that down. And then one of the things that's super hard to predict is what's going to happen with cryptocurrency. So we could hobble this entire economy by shutting down cryptocurrency, like China just outlawed all cryptocurrency, but Venezuela went the other way, and they have a federal cryptocurrency as a standard monetary system, right? If they do that, what will happen? Will they shut down specific coins? If so, the bad guys will start chasing unsanctioned coins. Will they shut down all blockchain transactions? Well, if not, then we'll just start chasing other things that are valuable on the blockchain. Like you'll have to pay me in NFTs or something silly, right? If we do get them shut down, we'd have to shut them down in every jurisdiction, or they'll just chase their jurisdictions and make you pay me in Brazil or whatever, right? And then they can also go back to kind of traditional money laundering tactics, but that's harder. Like it's hard to get $1 million worth of gift cards and transfer them to me, right? So it would reduce average ransom payments probably if they have to go back to traditional money laundering, but they can still do dead drops and they can still do gift cards and these other things, even if we get rid of crypto. So it doesn't necessarily make it go completely away, but it'll for sure hobble it. So I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for Q&A, and that's now. So do we have any specific questions? I haven't stayed up on the chat to see if there's Q&A in the chat.
Certainly, and this is Troy again, the moderator. We have one question from Priscilla. Does using a ransomware broker avoid violating U.S. federal regulations against payments to sanctioned entities? And if you don't have an answer, I do.
I do. Absolutely not is the answer. And there is not established case law, and this is problematic for a couple of reasons, right? So who is in violation is yet to that hasn't really been worked out in court, right? So there are several people who stand to be in violation here. You as the victim, your insurer, who's probably the person who's actually paying the payment, the ransomware broker who's actually making the transaction. Currently, the Treasury has talked a big game, but there hasn't been much teeth behind this, and they haven't gone after anybody yet. And I think it's partly because they're still trying to decide who's the right person to go after, right? Like, who do you go after in this scenario? Do you re-victimize the victim? Do you go after the brokers who are making money off of this? Do you go after the insurers who don't want to be doing this either? Who would you violate, and what would it help? And the answer today is no, it does not protect you at all. And you don't want to be the one who finds out, right? You don't want to be the one who establishes the precedent for case law. I'd be curious to hear, Troy, what your answer is.
Well, actually, my answer is that whoever pays, whether it's the broker or the person who pays the broker, is going to be the one who is breaking the law. So yeah, the regulators will be following that, right back the chain, where the money came from. And sure. Yeah, if there's a sanctioned individual who's getting paid, then yeah, that is illegal, and yeah, there will be hell to pay.
Right. And I think that's part of why there's not a bunch of enforcement teeth, right? Because who you'd want to shut down are the brokers who are profiting off of this, and not victimize the victim, right? So I think that's part of why we haven't seen a lot of teeth behind fining people for paying sanctioned entities. But it's just a matter of time, because we can't continue to take it. And just this month, there's been a lot of tough talk out of the Biden administration. And just yesterday, Australia put forth a whole suite of anti-ransomware laws that criminalize a bunch of ransomware activity, criminalize paying ransoms. It's one of the more comprehensive suites. I don't think it's all the way ratified yet, but it's a game changer. And if other people in the world start to follow suit, if that works and other people start to follow, then I think we'll start to see a change in what happens when you pay.
All right, very good. We have another question. Stephanie asks, I'm interested in learning more about how ransomware spreads horizontally, particularly when between different operating systems. What are some good resources on that topic?
Sure. So I'm trying to think if there are, it's hard because a lot of them are different. And like each kind of player has their own kill chain, right? And sometimes they get reused, but how they actually execute their east-west moves, how they actually execute their exfiltrations, how they all that kind of stuff is different per group. So oftentimes going and studying individualized groups is the way to go. And a lot of your malware vendors have like pretty extensive write-ups on the kill chains of individual groups. So if you go out to CrowdStrike, for instance, and type in one of those names that was on my list there, your wizard spiders, Conti, those types of names, with CrowdStrike, you will find pretty extensive write-ups of the kill chain for each one. But it's hard to it's hard to go read up on an overarching kill chain because they all have different kill chains. But with that said, what I don't want to do is discourage you from trying to bake that into your SIM rules, right? So if what we want to do ultimately, if what you want to do is research and figure out how these folks work, then the AV providers is where to find that research. If what you want to do is figure out how to stop that activity, then MITRE is the place to look, right? You can go out to the MITRE attack framework, and there's lots of resources out there to help you figure out like what kind of rules could I put in place to find east-west traversal no matter what the kill chain is.
Appreciate that. Now, I did have a question concerning having a plan, or actually having a page in your playbook for paying ransomware. You answered it pretty good by by indicating that, yeah, you don't want that to be discoverable, or else you're going to be getting in trouble, you know, when right. You do your deposition. But certainly actually having a plan, I think you answered it very well. Having a plan in your back pocket, whether it's written down or not, is a really good idea.
Your email is discoverable. You need to have an incident response plan, but where that plan needs to stop is with who do we contact in the break glass scenario, right? So we'll reach out to our cyber insurance, and oftentimes your cyber insurance, when you call their hotline, they'll provide you with a breach coach, or maybe you have a third-party legal on retainer and they'll provide you with breach coach services. Your breach coach will engage a broker. Your breach coach will tell you when it's time to engage a broker, and they will handle that for you. So you don't need to even have that in your plan, and you don't need to discuss it in any written format. Where your plan can stop is with, we will engage the breach coach and do whatever the breach coach tells us to do. And then all that broker stuff falls under that umbrella and you don't get yourself in trouble. The other thing, when you're engaging forensic firms, when you're engaging brokers, coaching resources, investigators, like when it's time to call Mandiant or whoever and get them to come in and do your investigation, don't contract with them. Have your third-party legal contract with them, right? And do a tri-party agreement so that whatever they find is then covered under your attorney-client privilege. They'll report it back to your attorney. Your attorney will explain it to you, and it will be all covered under privilege.
Very good. And with that, we're out of time. We did have a question from Richard about whether your slides will be available, but I'll let you put your email address in the chat if you're interested in sharing those. And now we need to go on to the next presenter, Walt Powell, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm adding my email to the chat right now. Have a great conference.